this point, I'd like to welcome Andy Hoar, who is my next guest. Andy is this. Hi, Andy. How are you?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Doing well. So, Andy is the CEO of Paradigm B2B, and a consultancy that offers a wide range of services to B2B e-commerce practitioners, software vendors, and commerce service providers. Andy's one of the leading authorities on B2B e-commerce business and strategy, as well as digital transformation impacts on selling models. I've known Andy, I think, probably 15 to plus years, and he's consulted extensively with distributors and manufacturers around the world. Prior to founding Paradigm B2B, Andy was vice president and principal analyst at Forrester Research, where he authored the definitive work on B2B e-commerce, which we'll talk about here momentarily. He's also the founder of B2B Next, an annual conference on digital transformation, which MDM is a proud media partner for, and we'll touch on that in our conversation as well. It takes place in late September this year virtually, and it's a great resource for all of you. That it's really complementary and additive to our mission over the next 2 days here together as well. So Andy, welcome.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to frame our conversation by going back 5 years to the old normal and how digital transformation has been fundamentally changing traditional B2B selling models. Then I'd like to shift gears and come to today, talk about what the new normal is. And then finally, I'd like to get your take on what you see in terms of the future of digital and selling and distribution. So to start that out, you authored that report, Death of a B2B Salesman. And the key soundbite out of that was your prediction that by 2020, e-commerce would eliminate 1 million B2B sales jobs. But your insights really went much deeper into the key issues that we've been researching and building for this sales GPS community for the last 4 years. And it's really at the heart of it, the dysfunction of the traditional outside sales model that's been really pressured by all of this digital transformation taking place. So bring us up to date, I guess, to talk a little bit about how you've seen your analysis play out and evolve since that report that you wrote.
Yeah, so I take no joy in this, but to be honest, I think I got it right that we would see a massive disruption caused by digital. In this case, the part I got wrong was that it wasn't really just caused by digital, it's caused by a pandemic, which manifests itself in digital. But we said in 2015, by the end of 2020, we'd have 1 million people displaced, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And if anything, we may have gotten it wrong in that there actually may be more displacement than the 1 million we predicted. So, when we looked at this, I often had questions after I wrote this piece where people oversimplified the conclusion. And let me complexify it a little bit, if that's even a word. So when we talked about what would happen between 2015 and 2020, we identified basically 4 quadrants for sales reps. And this is really important because some of the quadrants actually we think stood to improve their station in life. It was several, though, others where we thought that it would go in the other direction. So it wasn't uniform. And we always predicted that the consultative selling rep was actually going to thrive in this new digital environment, not just because of digital sales and freeing that person up, but also because of digital enablement technologies, which I'm sure you're going to talk about at some point, maybe we'll talk about today. It was really this quadrant, which, we had 2, I'm trying to do this, in a little box here, but the y-axis was the complexity of the product or service. And the x-axis in our 4-quadrant box was the complexity of buyer dynamic. Quick example, a highly complex product that has a pretty dynamic, pretty complicated buying environment will be something like an ERP system. It's a complex thing. You can't just buy it off the shelf and know how it's going to work. And of course, it touches so many different dimensions of a company's business that it requires cross-functional teams. You're really selling to a team. You're selling to the C-suite or something like that. Well, you're not going to just put that into a shopping cart online, you hit go, and then get your confirmation email. We never expected that. That's still the domain, and very much the domain, of somebody who's a consultative seller. Those sales reps are very talented people. They're highly paid, and they're really more consultants than they are sales reps. So they're consultants that happen to be doing sales rep kind of work. On the other end of the spectrum, though, you've got like a low complexity product in a sophisticated buying environment. And that might be somebody who's buying, antivirus software. You buy it, I buy it. It's complex software, but we all know how to do it, and we can just add it to our shopping cart and be done with it. Then there's this really, dangerous area, I think, for sales reps. We call them the order takers. And these are people who are selling essentially commoditized products in an environment where the buyers can effectively order online. So imagine like buying printer toner for your small business, right? I don't need to talk to a sales rep to buy printer toner that I've already bought and I buy every quarter for 10 years. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think there was a failure for people to understand that each one of these quadrants is different. And they're each going to be impacted differently by things like the size of the organization, whether it's an enterprise business or a small business. They're going to be impacted by the sophistication of the buyers, the vertical you're in. Nobody's going to buy an MRI machine, by adding it to cart, even though they may know quite well how to do it. And they may be pretty sophisticated buyers. It doesn't, not everything fits the model perfectly, but what we have seen is that the vast majority of the displacement we saw was going to happen with the order takers and the other group, one level up, called explainers, who, as the name implies, spend a lot of time explaining things. Well, why are they explaining things? They're explaining things because there's no other alternative for securing that information. Well, in a digital environment, you can go read to your heart's content, and you don't necessarily need an explainer. So it's really shifted the sales rep value add over to what it really always was. In fact, if you want to think about it this way, it peeled away the other areas, and it enabled sales reps to focus on what they do well, which is to sell solutions and systems and services, things that are not easily added to cart.
So how do you see that having evolved over the last 5 years in terms of are B2B sellers doing better in terms of what you describe as really a very fragmented selling environment and ecosystem? How far has that progressed in the last 5 years?
Well, I'd say pre-pandemic, which was February of this year, up until February of this year, okay to poor. After the pandemic started in March to the present, good to exceptionally good. And frankly, I'd love to give credit to the companies for having, had revelations and epiphanies about digital. I think that would be overly generous. I think necessity is the mother of invention, and there's nothing like a crisis to focus people's efforts. So it was out of necessity they had to be able to do these things. And I think one thing that was interesting is it's like somebody walking across a high wire beam. I've never done it before, but I've been told, especially if you're pretty close to the ground, you walk differently when there's a net underneath you. When the net's pulled away, it causes you to walk a bit differently. I think that's what happened here too, is when there was no net, it forced these companies to think differently about this. When there was no fallback procedure, like, we'll just go back to having sales reps in territories, which, by the way, you guys were talking earlier about this. I feel incumbent upon me to mention this. A territorial sales rep almost seems anachronistic in this day and age. What's the territory? Why are things geographically bound? Things like that seem like minor differences, but they frankly are game changers. So I think if I had to summarize, I would say that, some people have done well on their own volition. Others have done poorly on their own volition. Some have done well being forced in this corner, and some have done poorly. But I would say by and large, most companies out of necessity have done pretty well, all things considered. Now, what I mean by pretty well is pretty well in terms of shifting from, offline to online. So the penetration of the digital sales component has gone up dramatically. We've seen this in B2C. I haven't seen any numbers on this for B2B yet, but I know it's gone from like 12% penetration to like 33% penetration in 6 months. I mean, 3x equivalent in B2C. I suspect when the B2B numbers come out, they'll look fairly similar to that. And I used to always say too that I thought the shift from the offline environment to the online environment, B2B, was going to actually go faster because there was less friction in the way. Most B2B selling is still done by the phone. And so if people are taking orders over the phone and they're talking over the phone, it's pretty easy to shift that from the phone call to the website versus B2C, for example, just by contrast. People enjoy the shopping experience. There's a social experience associated with it. I've joked for years, nobody needs to touch and feel ball bearings to know what they're like and which ones to buy. You don't need to see that part necessarily. And if you're going to talk to a person over the phone and read a part number off, that's actually more friction filled than it is just go to the website, type in that and find out maybe that there's a better part or perhaps there's a less expensive alternative. So I think that the transition has been strong for some, but I don't want to underplay this. There are a lot of companies that are struggling right now because their models are inflexible. The way they've always approached things is to have, sales reps take the calls. I remember when I was doing the research and subsequent to that, many of the people I interviewed said, our value add is people talking on the phone. I said, is that the same value add for the buyer? And when you ask that question, they say, oh, well, didn't really think about it that way. I'm like, well, that's probably the way you should think about it, right? I mean, it may work for you, but does it work for them? And I think what we've learned in the last 6 months is a whole lot of digital works pretty well, not perfectly in all cases, but pretty well for especially low value add purchases for B2B buyers.
Yeah. So I want to stick on this consultative piece and the comment you made about the territorial, because, typically the landscape in North American distribution, you've got the national broadline distributors. Typically, they've had more resources to invest in e-commerce and digital than more, the specialized, more local distributors. What are you seeing in terms of the broadline distributors today with those types of really robust e-commerce platforms versus specialized distributors who are really leveraging digital in different ways?
They're two different worlds. I mean, obviously there's some overlap. There are some specialized guys who are able to operate at scale. And then there are some broadline guys who have deep specialties, right? They're not just an inch deep and a mile wide, but they're a mile wide and maybe a mile deep, in some cases. So again, there's no one size fits all here. But I think the broadline guys they have the resources to do this. Their greatest enemy is agility or lack thereof. Speed. I always said speed kills. We live in a world now where speed is far more important than size. Now, the best of all worlds is speed and size. The worst of all worlds is no speed and no size. So most companies operate, again, I'm a 2x2 chart guy, if you hadn't noticed. Most people operate in those other quadrants where they're fast and big or fast and slow, or, you know what I mean? So there are only a few companies, and I think Amazon is an example of it, that's fast and big. Any coincidence that Amazon is such a deadly company for these guys? Because they're not just fast, they're also big. And in many cases, they're bigger than the biggest guys, which wasn't the case until maybe 10 years ago. I remember hearing people say, oh, Amazon's, cute, but not a threat. And then went from that to, oh my God, they're 100 times larger than we are now in our category. A couple of years ago when they announced they were entering the auto parts space, like all the stocks of all the companies went down like 15% the day of. All they did was announce they were entering the space. We've seen, not that I need to go on an Amazon tangent, but we saw CVS and Aetna merge at the very hint that Amazon was going to enter the medical insurance space or the distribution of prescription drug space. So I think a lot of the broadline guys need to have a serious discussion about where they are. Are they large and fast, or are they just large? And if they're just large, then you better figure out where your differentiator is in that regard. For the smaller guys, they can be more nimble. And I often say it's the example of like a marketplace. There are two types of marketplaces, and the marketplaces that you run and the marketplaces that somebody else runs. I've always used this language like market maker and market taker. So if you run your own marketplace, you're a market maker. Companies like Grainger in the B2B space and companies like Walmart in the B2C space, they're market makers. They have enough critical mass. They can compel their partners to join them as third-party sellers. But if you're one of those third-party sellers, or if you're not large enough to create a market, rather you're a market taker, and you're going to operate in somebody else's marketplace. There are some that can do both, and the really, really good ones can do both. But what I find is a bunch of companies that are market takers that really think they're market makers.
Yeah.
And you got to be honest with yourself and figure out which one you are. So I'd say the same thing about the broadline guys. Where are you? What are your strengths? Where do you go deep? I'm reminded just quickly of a company called Akron Hardware, which, it was a hardware company, on the order of a Home Depot or Lowe's from years ago. And they decided at one point that they couldn't compete with the big box guys. And so they decided to focus on one area they were specialized, which was doorknobs. And they became one of the world's leading distributors of doorknobs. Well, that was a pretty good move, because I suspected if they'd stayed in the delusional world that they were going to compete with the broadline guys, they'd be dead about right now. So again, it's a bit of self-introspection here. Where are we? What are we good at? And how can we compete?
Yeah. And by the way, you get points on the leaderboard for keeping with the theme that I mentioned around agility and that. So I just want to let you know about that. Thanks. And I want to stick with Amazon here, because, I've had this theory actually that Amazon has actually had some positive impacts from the fear that it's actually put and the momentum that it's really put into organizations to actually do something and pursue digital transformation where otherwise they may not have. And so I'm really interested in your take, and I think that's happened to a certain point in the last 3 years, and it feels like we just had a rocket launch back in, starting 6 months ago. You're really in touch with all these e-commerce providers and technology providers. I've got to believe that they're just exploding at this point.
Well, some are doing quite well. I mean, in the middle of the pandemic, I know many of them sort of felt guilty to be acknowledging that they're doing well. Salesforce reported record numbers the other day. Microsoft is worth $1.5 trillion, approaching $2 trillion. I mean, these software vendors are doing pretty well because, the world has kind of caught up with them. I think somebody mentioned this earlier about we did 5 years in 3 months. Well, imagine if you're a software company that had out-year forecasts, and now all that's happening is those out-year forecasts are being brought back into the present, which means when we get through this, it may go back to normal. But yeah, just this rapid digital acceleration has been a boon to these software guys. I still say the big issue is companies understanding what they need to do internally. And I don't mean by that is not like which software platform to select. I mean, I always said that that's the easy part. The hard part is figuring out how you're going to use this technology. What are you going to do? Who are you going to sell to? What are you not going to sell online? How are you going to sell? What's going to differentiate you? You can't just buy the same platform the competitor has and say, well, we'll just be like them. I mean, if you're just as good as the next guy, then there's no differentiation there. So I think there's a lot to this. Amazon has definitely been a forcing function, though. And I will say this, Amazon Business has, I believe, become now a part of the consideration set in many verticals. And what I mean by that, either they're at the beginning or the end of the process. The beginning of the process, because that's where people start and they do a search, or just Amazon in general. Or they start someplace else and they go confirm their purchase or just see what people had to say about it, maybe some reviews and some products, because people forget this. Amazon has a critical mass of ratings and reviews, and more so than I think even the broadline guys in kind of narrow areas. So critical mass really makes a difference. So if Amazon is in the consideration set at any point along the way, that means they're a threat. And by that, companies have to figure out, hey, are we gonna try and defeat these guys, or are we gonna try and figure out where we can coexist with them? I recommend the latter myself.
Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit. You spent a lot of time researching B2B buyers' habits and behaviors. What do you see that shifted in 2020, and what do distributors need to do differently to stay relevant today?
Well, I hate to say this, but it's more of the same. I mean, we're just seeing more desire on the part of buyers to move digital, and in the last 3 or 4 months, pronounced shift out of necessity. So I think if I had to point to one or two things that are particularly interesting is I personally believe, based on the research I've done, that search is far more important now than it's ever been. I used to always say that for the B2C companies, they think of search as almost competing with browse. And for B2B companies, they need to think about search as essentially displacing browse. And there's nothing worse than having a 16 character identification code for something, letters and numbers for a part number, and getting 15 of the 16 right and having a results coming back saying, we found nothing. So for doing things like stemming and intelligent contextual search, there are a lot of companies that are doing this now. The platform guys are, and of course, there's a whole cottage industry around third-party technology providers, the Bloom Reaches and the Coveos of the world that are really just focused on this. So to me, search is a critical component that I find oftentimes companies underestimate until they've gone through it. And the second generation guys all go running to having a best of breed search technology. But the first generation guys go, hey, it's just search, right?
So has the pandemic really just totally made the game all about search complete? I mean, has it accelerated that? I mean, what kind of impact has the pandemic had on that search important?
I think it's actually, it's heightened the need for really good search, because not only does the stemming have to work, the contextual part have to work, but it's got to be fast. I mean, the numbers have been pretty clear over this. Like, conversion rates drop in a measurable way based on slowness. I think the number is for every 3 seconds away in a return of a page, the conversion rate goes down by 7%. So, I'm sorry, every 1 second away it goes down by 7%. So 3 seconds, it's down 21%. You can just do the math here. I don't think that's changed. Do you? I mean, do you really think that people are more accommodating now, or things being slow? I think it's the other way. I think in a couple of years, we're going to see that it's every half second reduces the conversion rate by 7%.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about you mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but talk about that balancing the self-serve versus full-serve sales models. What's the role of an outside sales rep in 2020?
I said earlier that there are a couple of different configurations here to pay attention to. And in Death of a B2B Salesman, this was sort of lost in the pages of it too. We talked about there's pre-sales, sales, and post-sales. And there are large enterprises and small enterprises. And there are even different types of sales reps. You pointed out one, a field sales rep. And there's inside sales reps. There are call center reps. One of my insights was that the call center reps are becoming more like sales reps, and the sales reps are becoming more like customer service reps. The two worlds were kind of blurring. It's just one had more of a primary responsibility for selling something, and the other one had more of a primary responsibility for servicing somebody. But at the end of the day, the best, we're doing both. I mean, we hear this all the time from sales reps who say, look, the best sales I get, the best relations I have, are when people that contact me really for a customer service issue and I solve their problem. I demonstrate my value. Now, I don't think a lot of sales reps want to be doing that as a permanent condition, but when you service a customer, you solve a problem for them, you earn their loyalty. So, my sense is that the role of the field sales rep, the tactics have changed, but the need and the value hasn't. I mean, good, highly qualified field sales reps can still be the tip of the spear. There can be the people you go to can distill all this information. I mean, one of the things we often forget is there's a profusion of information out there, but profusion means confusion too. And, there's a lot of stuff out there, but that's not necessarily a solution. That's why search is so important. Mm-hmm. But, you can have a lot of information and to get even more confused. And now we find an almost backward bending way where people want to cut through the clutter and talk to somebody who can actually, help them out. So in a low information environment, they would just talk to somebody directly because it was easy. And in a high information environment, they might do the same. It's that one area in the middle where I've got kind of enough information, but not enough. Maybe I can just go with what I learned on my own. Maybe I need to talk to somebody. But that high information environment, getting advice and cutting through the clutter. Plus, people are time pressed, Even if you could find the answer on your own, maybe you'd still rather talk to somebody for the reassurance, or because this person knows more than you do.
Sure.
So I think the role of the field sales rep is the value is the same. But like I said, I think the tactics are changing. I think this idea of, we've all heard this one before, hey, I'm going to be in town next week. Love to take you out to lunch. Well, A, you're not going to be in town next week, and B, I'm not going to lunch. So what's your next option? And I think what I have seen is the emergence of the value of thought leadership. And this is something that software vendors learned a long time ago. I think distributors should start really in this one serious thought. If you want people to pay attention to you, you better be different, and you better demonstrate your domain expertise, especially in a world where what separates you from a mega distributor like Amazon is domain expertise. So, here's a radical thought. Maybe distributors should start publishing white papers on things. I mean, I say that facetiously because they do some of this stuff. But it's not, the typical way in which they think. And I believe that's what they should be doing. Now, why did I bring this up? Because I think this is the ammunition that sales reps are going to use to get their foot in the door. Instead of the, hey, I'll be in town next week, let's go to lunch. It's, hey, I've got this great piece of thought leadership done by an independent group that establishes that our stuff is actually significantly better than everybody else. Let's have a conversation about this, because I want to make sure you're getting the right kind of value for what you're paying.
Yeah, great points, Andy. We just have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to leave a little bit of time. B2B Next is coming up later this month. What do you have on tap that this audience should pay attention to in particular?
Yeah, so you mentioned change management earlier at the very top of this, and I was nodding on this side because we have 4 tracks at the event. And I think they're the 4 key tracks. It's really digital business models, change management, channels, and technology. And we cover all of them extensively. We have panels, we have case studies, we have peer-to-peer discussions. I know you have some of this as well. We have workshops. That's been sort of our pride and joy as we do workshops.
You've got some great keynotes. For this audience, you've got DG McPherson from Granger. You have Kathy Mazzarella from Graybar, and several others. So great lineup.
And you mentioned organizational agility. We have a couple of sessions about that, literally taught by people who have done this. I want to highlight 2 quick things as we close here. So on the tech side, I'm actually hosting a panel. For those of you in the market for an e-commerce platform, or just curious where everybody stands, I've never seen this before, and I'm kind of proud of myself. Let's pat myself on the back for doing this. We're going to have IDC, Forrester, me, and maybe some other guests who will show up. Well, we're going to have a panel run by me talking about all the research in the space this year about platforms. I've written some. Gartner published the Magic Quadrant. IDC's got theirs. Forrester put theirs out. So I'm doing a panel of all those analysts. I've never seen that before, so that'd be pretty interesting, all in one place. The other thing is, I did an interview just the other day with Mark Mahaney. I think Mark Mahaney is a name some of your listeners and viewers may be familiar with. Mark wrote kind of the definitive piece on Amazon Business when he was and he's still there at RBC Capital. I had a chance to talk to him about that a little bit. So we're bringing people from the outside as well who are not beholden to any particular model. And he had some interesting things to say about Amazon.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah. I've been to a B2B Next. You do a wonderful job with that in terms of bringing together some great, like you say, all the different components into one room. I just really appreciate those final comments too, Andy, and want to thank you on that in terms of really a lot of what you talked about is also that domain expertise and transitioning that knowledge that distributors have and really transitioning just to different models and delivery systems in a lot of ways.
The value is there. It's not going anywhere. It's just manifesting itself differently. And I think for companies that have recognized this, take the lead, just final thought here, of like a Microsoft. Remember when Microsoft was dead and buried a couple of years ago, and now they're, hovering on being the most valuable company in the world? Yep. They transitioned to the cloud. Azure is driving a lot of their business. They thought differently. I think we're going to wrap the next session. Thanks for joining us, Andy. Thank you. You bet. Take care.